Hello and welcome to the next lecture of categorical propositions. Today we will talk about traditional square of opposition. Now, traditional square of opposition is basically a figure or a depiction through which you can understand the relations between categorical propositions. So, as we have seen in the last lectures, that we have four types of proposition: A, E, I, and O. So, I have put A, E, I, and O on four different parts of the square. We will talk about the relations of these propositions, but allow me to clarify a few things which may be found a little bit confusing sometimes. You will find this expression traditional square of opposition many a times as Aristotelian square of opposition. It is definitely Aristotelian by nature, but it is not Aristotle's. What it means is that it was not given by Aristotle, it was not talked about by Aristotle, or you will not find it. You will not find this depiction in Aristotle's Organon or precisely Prior Analytics, that is the book through which you will find the expressions or the explanation of the relations between the four types of propositions. But later, with a lot of commentaries which followed in the medieval era, you found that this became a common, I will say, expression through which logic was taught during that era, and square of opposition became, or the traditional square of opposition became the most, I will say, worked out or very popular way of expressing the relations between the four types of propositions. Now, A, E, I, O are also not exactly the propositions as suggested by Aristotle, as we have already discussed. And moreover, Aristotle has also talked about a few other kind of propositions as well. The singular propositions, the indefinite propositions, not only the universal and the particular propositions. So, but this is how this is expressed since the medieval era, but it was based on Aristotle's finding or based on Aristotle's theories. So it is called the best way of explaining will be traditional square of opposition. However, you will find it in a lot of books, this as Aristotle's square of opposition as well. Now, what are the relations? Like, you can see that A and E both are universal propositions, and what Aristotle and the later, say, medieval era philosophers or logicians will say that they share a relation between contrary, the relationship of contrary between, you will find between the universal propositions. Now, what does contrary mean? Contrary means that they cannot be true together. However, they can be false together. So they cannot be true together. I will write it like this. They cannot be true. However, they can be false. Now, what is the relation between two particular propositions, that is I and O? So it says that they cannot be false together. However, they can be true together. So this is the expression. Now, what does subaltern relationship means? Subaltern is the relation between the same quality propositions. You know what is the quantity and quality of proposition. The quality will be more like affirmative and negative, and the quantity is universal and particular, right? So if you talk about in terms of uh, um, the quantity, so you have seen that the relationship which are shared are quantity and subquantity. If you talk in terms of quality, so it is subaltern. Now, what subaltern says is that now in subaltern relationship, sometimes it is called as subaltern relationship, sometimes it is called as subalternation relationship, but you can call it in this universal proposition is called as superaltern, and the particular proposition, the corresponding particular proposition, is also called as subaltern, right? So what it says is that if the universal is true, then the particular is true, but not vice versa. Similarly, if the subaltern is false, then the superaltern is also going to be false, but not vice versa. And this is the relationship which is over here as well between E and O, right? So here also you will find this is true, then this has to be true. And if this is false, then this also has to be false, but not vice versa. So that is the relationship. And what is the relationship of contradiction? Contradiction relationship says that they can be neither true nor false together. So if A is true, then O definitely has to be false. If O is true, then A has to be false, and vice versa. The same goes for I and O relationship. So these relationships are contradictions. This relationship is contrary, this is subcontrary, and these two relationships are subaltern. So if you see, there are 1, 2, 3, and 4 relationships exactly, right? Because there is one relationship of contradiction, the second one is subordination, the third one is subcontrary, contrary, and the fourth one is subcontrary. So these are the relations which are expressed in the traditional square of opposition. And there are very interesting questions also which you will find to how to find the relationship between them, and if this is true, then what is going to be the result of that, and so on. But before going to that, let me also tell you certain more expressions about it, right? So the I will say the Boolean representation of these proposition. You know the representation of the Venn diagrams, right? The Venn diagrams of these you already know. I will just remove these so that you can see clearly that how these things can be very clearly seen as well, right? Uh, if you see the diagram of A, so it is more like this, right? That all S is P. I told you that if all S is P, so this is the relation. Exactly the opposite of this is drawn here, right? Here, here there is a cross. And here the relationship is expressed like this, Venn diagram. And here the relationship is like this, of Venn diagram, right? So this is something which you now know. And there is also Boolean representation of this as well. So what is going to be the Boolean representation of this? The Boolean representation of this is that if you see this, this is explained as SP bar is equal to 0, which says that the part of S which is not there in P is actually empty. Here SP is equal to 0. So these are basically the Boolean representations of this. Here SP is not equal to 0, and here SP bar is not equal to 0. So these are the Boolean representations of this. So you might be knowing about all these things, or you have to know about all these things, that when we talk in terms of the square of opposition, so these are certain things which you must be knowing. There are certain interesting questions also, like I told you about the relationship. You can pause the video and go back and revise the relationships or whatever I have expressed about it. Now the interesting question comes like this, like suppose if somebody says that if I is true, what is the value of A, E and O? Now we will be taking a lot of exercises in the class, and we will be also dealing with this, but initially students sometimes find a little bit difficult to take these kind of questions. Like suppose I told you about the relationship, I also I moved a little bit fast, I know, so you can always go back and watch the video again, or you can read the text and check that what are the relationship, what does it mean, and so on. And now if suppose somebody gives you this, that if I is true, what is going to be the value of A, E and O? So you can pause the video as I told you and check with yourself that what is going to be the results. Now you can pause and check. Now suppose if you have paused and checked what is going to be the value of A, E and O. So let us also try that how this needs to be solved, that what is going to be the value of A, E and O, if you know that I is true. So I, you know, is true, right? So the first thing which you should find out is the contradictory relationship. Wherever, so suppose somebody has given you the value of A or E or O or I, whatever. If you know one of the values, so you can find the values of others, right? But then what is the way to find it out? The best way to find it out is that whatever value you get, the first thing which you should try is to find the contradictory. So you know the value of I is true, right? So what is going to be the value of E? Now the value of E will be false because it is just going to be the opposite of that. So you know it, right? Okay, fine. So you found the value of E. Now what is going to be the value of A? The value of A you cannot determine. This is the problem, or this is the thing which I am trying to bring, that if you know the value of I is true, then you do not know the value of A. If you would have known that the value of I is false, then you definitely know the value of A, right? But since you know it to be true, so you know the value of I to be true, but then you cannot determine the value of A, because in that case it does not hold. If A would have been true, then I would have been true. But if I is true, then A, you cannot find it out. So the answer is undetermined. This is the value which your book will also say. You can also put a question mark. You can also say true or false. True slash false. It can be anything. But you cannot say it. You are not sure about it. Similarly, what is going to be the value of O? So you know the value of I is true. And you know that they cannot be false together. You know that these cannot be false together. So again, if it would have been false, so since you know that they cannot be false together, this value would have been true for sure. It is out of necessity that the value of O has to be true. But if you know that this value is true, what is going to be the value of A? Again, you do not know. You cannot determine, right? So the thing is that in case of O also, it is going to come as undetermined. So this is something which I wanted to bring to your notice, that look, you can be given a value and you need to understand that when I say they cannot be true together, it means that if this value is true, then definitely this has to be false. But if this is false, then what is going to be the value of this? You cannot say. That is the thing. If I say that these cannot be false together, so if one of them is false, then the other one has to be true. But if this one is true, then what is going to be the value of O? You cannot determine. This is the thing. The only thing which you could determine is that if I is true, then definitely E is going to be false. In rest of the two cases, this you cannot determine. So this is the thing. But now suppose if we take it as like if we would have been given. Now here the case was that we could determine only one value and the rest of the two values we could not find it out. But if suppose I is false, now whether we can determine the other three values, let us check. If I is false, then E has to be true, right? So we put E as true. Now if I is false, E is true. Now if I is false, you also know that A has to be false. So you know that A has to be false, right? So you know this. And you also know that if I is false, so since they cannot be false together, so this has to be true as well. So for O also you can find that this is going to be true. Now if you see these values and see whether there is any inconsistent relationship which is coming out, because we said that this and this value will be different from each other. So A here is false, so you can see O is true, so it is not violating any of the rules. We also know that I and O has to be different values, so I is F and E is true, so it is also not breaking any rule. We know that these cannot be true together, right? So A is false and E is true, so they are not true together. We know that I and O cannot be false together. So I you know as false and O is true, so they are also not violating any of the rules. So this is something which you should understand, or this is something which you should pick up, that there can be certain values through which you will not be able to find all the values, but there can be certain values with which you can find all the values. So that also is something which you should be getting, and moreover the relationships which you should understand. So contrary, just for revision I am telling you, contrary, they cannot be true together. Sub-contrary, they cannot be false together. Subaltern and say superaltern and subaltern relationship, whenever the superaltern is true, the subaltern has to be true, but not vice versa. And whenever the subaltern is false, the superaltern has to be false, but not vice versa. And contradiction, if one of the contradiction is true, then the other has to be false. That means that they cannot be true together, they cannot be false together, right? So if one of them is of one value, then the other one will be of the opposite value. So here, irrespective of the fact, whatever the value of A, E, I or O is given to you, you will always be able to find the contradictions value. The rest of the two values you may or may not find. That is something which you should understand. So this is more or less the working of square of opposition, and you know that what relationships hold, how they work, or what are the relationships and so on. In the next class, what we will do is that we will meet and discuss the modern square of opposition or the revised square of opposition.